Well, hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is February 21st, 2026, 11:48 a.m. This post is going to be about Edward S. Herman, Uncle Ed. Uh, my previous post, I covered my early days of study, which began in earnest when I subscribed to the Lives of Our Times, uh, which turns out that Ed was the editor of it. I didn't know it at the time. And I mentioned that in my first page of my first issue was the most memorable, as the New York Times fraudulently translated Arabic script in order to portray all Arabs as religious fanatics. And it wasn't their first time doing that. That article, that in Lives of Our Times, the acronym is LOOT, Loot. And so I'll call it Loot sometimes. Ed also referred to it as Loot in my correspondence with him. Uh, and in fact, I asked his permission early in our relationship to reproduce the graphics, which I have on my website from these New York Times so-called translations of Arabic script. And Ed was happy to see that, happy to see that I was helping the lives of our time to live on. And the article didn't have a byline, so it was again the inside cover page. And but the last sentence said, I quote, "We are not holding our breath while waiting to see if the Times prints Abraham's letter." And that's the kind of wit. And to me, that means that Ed wrote that. And I get it. He probably wrote all the non-bylined articles in Loot. Yeah. And so that was kind of the my first instance of the kind of wit that I came to love of Ed's. Um, and I really can't. And again, before I subscribed, I didn't know who Ed was. I heard of Chomsky the year before, but I really had not heard of Ed. Didn't have any idea of his relationship with Noam, any of that. And I can't really pinpoint when Ed's work began growing on me, but it was probably a gradual process over the next 2 years. And I doubt that I bought any of Ed's books by then, other than Manufacturing Consent, because he co-wrote it with Noam. And Loot went out of business in late 1994. They had in fact, I believe it was Ed who set up they had a patron who was funding the whole show. Their losses, yeah, subscription weren't beginning to cover it, which is typical media issue, right? And so anyway, so it was around for 4 years. In fact, Noam later he called it a great magazine, and it was. It was my introduction to media analysis, media studies. And when that went out of business, late '94, I began subscribing to Z Magazine. Actually, I bought an issue before that, and like a year or two before that. And anyway, it seemed like a good thing to subscribe to. And then it turned out Ed wrote an article each month for that, for Z Magazine. And Noam regularly contributed. And Z Magazine was run by Michael Albert and his partner, Lydia Sargent. And they also co-founded South End Press, which published Ed and Noam's first major work together after their initial effort was censored. And so, and Ed used South End Press several times, as I recall, to publish his own books. And so he used them regularly. And again, and 2 years, so 2 years after I began subscribing to Loot, and again, I was studying everything. And I mentioned this before, that it took about 2 years for me to really understand what Noam was saying. So it was so alien, even though I was such an eager student, it was so alien to what I'd been raised with. It took me about 2 years to really get Noam on his non-linguistics political work. And in late 1992, the movie Manufacturing Consent came out. But by that time, as I remember, Ed was in it for about 20 seconds or so. And I remember at that time I was aware enough of it. I was really pleased to see him in that. And as I've written, about a week after I watched that movie with my wife at Ohio State University. Yeah, none of that. And Manufacturing Consent, to my knowledge, has never played at it never had a mainstream theatrical release or has ever appeared on network television in the United States. Even though it's the most popular, it was the most popular documentary in Canadian history to its time. It was made in Canada. And that kind of says it all, right? So, one of the leading intellectual distance in history, he's far more famous outside the United States than in it. So, and that movie was another indicator of that. Um, and again, I wrote a 17-page letter to Noam, driven from my sleep to write a 17-page letter to Noam there in late, like November of '92, and was amazed that 2 weeks later I actually got a letter back from Noam, which began as we corresponded for the next several months back and forth. In fact, eventually sent him my first book. Anyway, but he sort of politely brushed me off, and Noam was a busy guy, so I got it. So I didn't bother Noam again after that. And I had a bunch of Noam's books. So again, when I started, after getting Lives of Our Times, uh, again, about manufacturing consent, but I was studying a lot of things. And I started buying Noam's books back then. So again, reading a lot of his work. Um, but I don't think I bought any Eds at that time. I don't think it was until, well, except for manufacturing consent, but after Luton went out of business in '94, and I started subscribing to Z Magazine. I think that's when I began buying Ed's books. And my guess is that there were probably, because South End Press, right? And the same people ran Z owned South End Press. So it was probably that connection, how I ended up starting to buy Ed's books. And Ed, I found that Ed's work, and probably since IQ is probably a lot closer to mine. I've seen this phenomena. Yeah, no one was way up there somewhere. And so to me, his work was kind of challenging to read and understand exactly what he was saying. Again, it took me 2 years. I found Ed's work to be much easier to understand, much more accessible. And so, it was easier reading Ed's stuff. I understood it really. Again, it didn't take a lot of work for me to understand Ed's work. And then Ed was funny. So Ed had this dry wit. That was one of the. It was bonus material for me where Ed was always funny. Yeah, every article would have something that was a funny. Ed would make these, again, very dry, kind of understated humor, but I loved it. Yeah, so it was Ed was he played to that. In fact, to his Beyond Hypocrisy, one of his books. Again, this is illustrative of Ed's sense of humor. And so Beyond Hypocrisy was the title came from the fact that Ed was, in his work, Studies of the Government and the Media, etc., he says hypocrisy is too tame a word to use for what he was seeing. So he started using chutzpah, which is a Yiddish term for just in-your-face impudence, etc. So Ed christened chutzpah as the successor to hypocrisy in his writings. And so Beyond Hypocrisy, that was that meant. It's like it's more than hypocrisy. It veers into chutzpah. And in fact, his book Beyond Hypocrisy was illustrated by a political cartoonist, Matt Worker. And so it's a thing where no one would have never done something like that. But anyway, so Ed Worker, political cartoonist. Again, his works were funny. And again, not over the top funny, but because it was dealing with some pretty grim subject matter, but funny. And Ed's work was funny, and I loved it. So I loved getting my dose of Ed. And back in the '90s, then I started buying Ed's books and reading them. I said I was reading them every month. That was really my golden age of reading Ed's work, and that was actually his most prolific writing time, because he retired from Wharton back in '89. I believe. And so he was still a Wharton when he published Manufacturing Consent. He wrote it. But in the '90s, not only did he edit Lives of Our Times, he wrote several books during the '90s and articles. So it wasn't just Z Magazine, Covert Action. I remember had an article. He wrote for MR Online. And in fact, not much by then, but some. So, but he was just he was ubiquitous in the kinds of the areas that I was treading into in my studies. Ed was he was out there a lot, and so anyway, it was great. I devoured his output back in the 90s. And that was a wonderful time for me, reading Ed's work. Um, and later on, again, this is all part of this oral history that I'm going to be doing, which will going to be a lot of posts, I think. But later on, I'll write about how I first became aware of blemishes to Christopher Columbus's image when I read in reading Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. There was a chapter devoted to Columbus and his feat and how it really wasn't quite as heroic as portrayed. And that was in '92. And then you know, in the future I'll get into this more. But that was really my first time I'd ever heard of anybody, you know, present any blemish as to Columbus's image. Yeah, so you know, as you're in kindergarten, you're raised with pilgrims and Columbus and this kind of stuff. And so, first time I'd ever heard of anybody, you know, writing. The first time I'd seen anything where they were calling into question Columbus's heroic stature, which eventually led to my Columbus essay, which is actually one of the first essays that I wrote on my site as it exists today. So I wrote that in '98. And that was really, in fact, that and my fluoride essay were the two first earliest essays that's on my site as it stands today. And those were, yeah, those were early examples of how I did what I do. And then I hired an editor in 1999, and that was wonderful having an editor. It really took my work up a few levels. And in 2001, I revised my Columbus essay, and again from my editorial, you know, my editorial process. And in that, I don't do this anymore, but back then I did that actually. So I quoted significantly. I quoted a couple paragraphs from Howard Zinn's book, People's History, in my Columbus essay. And then this is the innocent days of the internet, although this was only a couple of weeks after 9/11 terror attacks. And I was able to easily find Howard Zinn's email address, you know, around the internet. So I just, you know, looked him up and sent an email. I said, yeah, I linked to this, my draft. I hadn't really published it to the world yet. So it was an essay draft, and I asked Zinn's permission to publish that passage from A People's History. Out of the blue, right? So I found some email address. I sent it off to Howard Zinn, and again, this is, you know, two or 3 weeks after 9/11, like 2 weeks after 9/11, and when this country was going insane, and the left was actually really trying to prevent an invasion of Afghanistan at that time. So I figured Howard was up to his eyeballs probably in a lot of stuff, and so I think it was on a Sunday. So on a Sunday morning, I sent an email to Zinn asking, you know, and said, here's the, you know, linking to, here's the essay and here's the passage. And I was just, you know, hoping to get his permission. I didn't know if I'd ever hear back from Howard Zinn. I mean, out of the blue like that, somebody like him. And I heard from that evening, same day. Not only did he not only give me permission, but he actually read my essay and praised it. And this was, you know, one of the is similar to my encounters with Chomsky and then with Ed and stuff. These were incredibly gracious people. My impression of them through the written work was fully borne out in my personal encounters with them. Yeah, these were great human beings, and so that Zinn did that. It was just like, wow, he's in my pantheon. Yeah, he and Herman are all in my pantheon. And then actually a new academic journal published my Columbus essay a month later. In fact, they contacted me, and nothing to do with Zinn. Just somehow some academic stumbled upon it, and he actually asked if he could publish it in a academic journal, which was an honor. So sure, and it's still out there. So in fact, I linked to it in this accompanying post, or an academic journal published it, that draft of it. I've revised it a little since then, and I'll probably revise it again one of these days. Like, I revise everything eventually. The nice thing about having web pages, so I can easily edit them. and now I'm going to discuss my relationship and how it began with Ed. And so anyway, after that encounter with Zen, literally an amazing encounter with Zen, I decided I'd try my luck with Ed, whose email address was always also surprisingly easy to find. Anyway, so I sent an email to Ed, and in the end, I linked to it. I published my email to Ed, and Ed, again, by that time, I've been reading his work for over a decade by then, and it was like he was my Uncle Ed. And actually, in my email to him, I said, "Yeah, I think of you as Uncle Ed." And so, and over the years, he even signed an email or two to me, signed Uncle Ed, to my lasting amusement. Yeah, that's part of what I loved about it. He didn't take himself too seriously. It was so wonderful to interact with Ed. Yeah, he came across as the avuncular man that he's seen from his writings, like Zen. It's like these really friendly, helpful guys. I mean, saints. Yeah, Zen and Ed, these guys were saints. And so this is one of the highlights of my uh, internet communication career was interacting with those guys. But we only communicated by email. But in these day and age, that's pretty typical. In fact, after his death, I heard from one of his co-authors of one of his works, and he only knew Ed through emails. And so yeah, so you could actually, in fact, in the manufactured consent, when he wrote it, when they interviewed Ed about his interactions with Noam, he says, we didn't see each other much at the beginning. We didn't see each other. We were just exchanging manuscripts, etc. So this is how it works. We used to work with Ed, and so yeah. So it never got beyond email with Ed. I wish it had, but Ed passed before that ever happened. And when I eventually offered to improve Ed's libelous Wikipedia biography, I hoped it would spur an effort to bring a professional in. I was hoping that my efforts would lead to a professional doing a biography on Ed. I mean, there's a bunch of that kind of stuff around Noam, but nobody done anything like that with Ed. In fact, Ed also kind of discouraged that. So I remember saw some quote interview with him. He goes, "I don't have no biography." So he was never really that disclosing of his personal life publicly, not very. Like I didn't find out he was Jewish till after he died, So anyway, this is a thing where Ed was really played that close to the vest, and I think he just felt like it wasn't important, In fact, no, same thing. No one always deflect personal inquiries because they figured that the subjects they dealt with were far more important than their own personal lives. I got that. And what I hope, so when I offered to improve Ed's Wikipedia biography, I hoped again it would lead to a professional biography, and I hope I live to see that. So Ed is definitely one of the greatest intellectual dissidents in American history. And I think his life definitely merits at least one biography, other than what I've done, which is mostly it's about his work, not his life so much. And yeah, I think Ed preferred it that way, but I have to admit, it'd be nice to know more about Ed the man, more than I already encountered. And in fact, what I hope when I offer to improve his Wikipedia biography, I hope that he would see I was serious and that I was doing a lot of work and that it would lead to something. Again, bringing a professional in, etc. But I get ahead of myself, and I'll back up a little bit to the first time I contacted Ed. And so after that initial exchange with Ed, and Ed was, again, when I heard back from him, he's just like, "Hey, young man," young man, but he's just like, he was friendly. He said, "Keep in touch." He saw my site and he goes, "Ooh, maybe I should do something like that." So it was just really, again, it was wonderful. It was wonderful to interact with Ed that way. And but Ed, Ed, in my opinion, he was arguably the most how to say it. He was the greatest media analyst on earth at the time. Probably, he was up there. He was up there somewhere. And I knew he was busy. So even though he was retired, monthly articles in Z Magazine and books. Again, he's been he published quite a few books over the previous years. And I didn't want to take up his valuable time with chit chat. You know, it was a thing where I only contacted Ed when I had something that I thought was important, you know, to find out about or whatever. And I remember, and again, back in the 90s, you know, we're talking late 90s now, I rather naively, I would say, contributed to Amnesty International, you know, just a donor. But soon after I began communicating with Ed, I remember I started getting these mailings from Amnesty International that was campaigning to have Milosevic, who was the former president of Yugoslavia, prosecuted by the tribunal at The Hague there, which was a kangaroo court. And so Ed read about this, and Ed read about what a kangaroo court was going on there in Yugoslavia. And so, Ed had been writing about what we'd done to Yugoslavia for a while by that time. And so I wrote to him. I said, Ed, I was kind of confused. I'm going, why the heck is Amnesty International campaigning to have Milosevic, essentially arrested and brought to a tribunal? Well, in fact, Milosevic died in its custody. In fact, and he may have been murdered by them. And so, in fact, Ed was more like it was criminal negligence why Milosevic died, but Ed's attorney actually thought it was murder, which I'll get into soon. Anyway, I asked Ed. I said, "What's going on here? Why am I getting these? Why am I getting this from Amnesty International of all places to try to have this guy, prosecuted at a kangaroo court?" And Ed he admitted it was scandalous. Amnesty's campaign, he said it was just scandalous. And so, Ed said that he had given up on trying to support any of those big human rights organizations. The big prominent human rights organizations, Ed was like, they're all corrupted. They're basically imperial tools. And so Ed just said he only contributed to small local human rights organizations, such as in the Balkans or former Yugoslavia. And in fact, in 2007, actually, Ed wrote Red and his buddies wrote an article about the corruption in Human Rights Watch, which was an imperial tool from the beginning. And in fact, I didn't mention it here, but when that came out, I emailed Ed and said, "What are you doing on Amnesty International?" And Ed said he wouldn't. He goes, "Yeah, Amnesty International is not as bad as Human Rights Watch." I go, "Okay, Ed." Well, however, in later years, when he wrote about Rwanda, etc., he stuck it to Amnesty. Yeah, he really got into how Amnesty International had totally betrayed the idea of human rights. And Rwanda, Libya, it was Amnesty's behavior was scandalous. In fact, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Chris Black, who was Ed's colleague, in fact, I'll get into this soon, but he said the same thing. And he goes, I used to donate to Amnesty also before I really realized what their game was. And so anyway, this is all part of the learning experience you go through in these areas. And so the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, that was one of my lifetime's most agonizing events. And in fact, I was in a number of peace. In fact, I was in the 1999 WTO the peace march before it became, the day before it became, violent or, this sort of, infamous, famous police action. The night before I was marching next to priests and nuns, and I met the former Washington governor, etc. It was definitely a different crowd than the next day when it was tear gas, this kind of thing. And then, when 9/11 happened, I was, in those days I did that kind of stuff. I had a friend who was into that, so I did peace marches. In fact, also peace marches to try to prevent the Afghanistan invasion and also try to prevent the Iraq invasion, which was all futile, right? It didn't stop the empire from steamrolling over those nations. And as Noam accurately said, the invasion of Iraq is the crime of the century so far. Yeah, it was up there with what Hitler did to Poland. It was. Yeah, people like that, but literally, it's like the closest thing is anything is aggressive invasion of another nation under false pretext. And so, In fact, Hitler had more excuse probably for invading Poland than we did for invading Iraq. Um, and in those days, actually, there was a quasi-mystical kind of new agey activist who was promoting my work, kind of as Beverly Hills housewife. And during that, she was promoting my work during the invasion of Iraq. And then, I put her in touch with Ed. So she went public and said she wanted to do something to help out with what was happening to Iraq, to actually, tell the Iraqi people it isn't all Americans kind of thing. I don't know what good that was going to be. But anyway, I put her in touch with Ed to give her some ideas for what kind of activism she wanted to do. And I was copied in on some of this for a little while. So it was like, and I was, because I brokered I brokered the arrangement. And well, this woman, she got the hots for Ed. Yeah, she was like, she had the hots for the guy. And I was kind of, that wasn't my intention of introducing, her to Ed so she could get the hots for him. And so I was kind of amused, alarmed, and kind of embarrassing. And and that was never very disclosing about his personal life publicly. And so I didn't know that he was actually been happily married for nearly 6 years at that time. And so that was kind of, I didn't introduce another woman to Ed after that. That was just like, it was kind of an embarrassing situation for me. And amusing, embarrassing, alarming, this kind of stuff. And I'm sure Ed was not going to become her boy toy, that's for sure. Um, anyway, so soon after the invasion of Iraq, actually, Brian O'Leary recruited me into co-founding what became called the New Energy Movement. And Brian, because I had already been writing I had been again my work again. I don't like to call my work leftist. I call it comprehensive, but it definitely, again, it uses Noam's work, Ed's work, Zen's work, Parenti's work, this kind of thing. Because I think it's right, it's valuable, it's accurate, it's and it doesn't have nearly the stature that it should have in the United States. Um, and anyway, Brian was, again, he was advisor to several presidential candidates, all Democrats or independents. And again, he was the speechwriter and energy advisor for Mo Udall when he ran for president in 76. And so Brian had serious, again, he was Capitol Hill activism, Ivy League professor, ex-astronaut, all this kind of stuff. And so Brian had impressive credentials. And so anyway, and Brian told me that he and I were the two guys of the people he had recruited. We're the guys who are going to engage the left on the issue of new energy, or as I call it, free energy. And so anyway, so here's ex-astronaut, Ivy League professor, advisor to presidential candidates, and I try to introduce him to Ed. 3 or 4 times I tried to introduce him to Ed. And right when we were trying to get the new energy moving off the ground. And Ed was never interested. He was, I never heard back. He just like, I wouldn't hear back from Ed when I tried to introduce him to Brian. And in fact, Ed, one of our exchanges, he admitted to me that he neglected energy in his economic writings. And so, it was more the banking issues, et cetera. But it's a thing where energy, economics is all based on energy. And this is what my work's about. And but free energy, so he not only neglected energy, but free energy was a bridge too far for Ed. And it was a bridge too far for pretty much everybody on the left. And so Brian, again, near Brian's life's end, he was beside himself at how all progressive venues that actually talked about solutions and even energy solutions for energy is totally off the table. And Brian was really beside himself with that. And this is something that, this is the kind of things that led me to, come with my levels of free energy awareness and level 3 of, the so-called experts who deny the possibility or desirability of free energy, the laws of physics objections and conspiracy theory objections on organized suppression, these kinds of things. So anyway, again, Ed was busy as arguably the world's leading media analyst, and so at nearly age 80, and so after those times with Brian, I never brought up free energy again to Ed. I didn't hold it against him. I was sympathetic to his lack of interest. And typical of trying to engage the left on these issues. But Ed was a busy boy at almost age 80. In fact, his wife, she died. Actually, she died another decade later, I guess. But yeah, Ed was, and she had poor health, I know, for a number of years before that. So anyway, Ed was busy, and so I never bothered Ed again on the issue of energy, and that was fine. I was really okay, Ed. That's not it's not an area of interest for you. That's fine. Um, After that, so after the activists got a hot for him, after trying to introduce him to Brian, after that, um, I only interacted with him a couple times a year, probably 2, 3 times a year, something like that. And in fact, I remember when Howard Zinn died in 2010. I asked him. I said that was anyway. I in my post here I quote Ed, and he's like, "Yeah, that was a painful shock." And he called Zinn an awfully good and valuable man, you know. And and Ed though, like he finished that reply with, "I hope you're well. The political scene is really stinko," you know. So the only I ever heard the word stinko, I think, in my lifetime was then. Um, and the last big writing project of Ed's life was about Rwanda. And so, yeah, in the 2000s. So Ed, and again, that was a consummate co-author. So he had many co-authors over the years, and and he got him a number of these co-authors to write articles for him and loot this kind of thing. Uh, and Ed, though, when he got to be about 75, he took on this guy named David Peterson. Said young guy, he's probably my age or something. And he became Ed's co-author in his last years. In fact, the last 15, 16 years of his life, Ed was his co-author. I mean, David was his co-author. In fact, David published a book of anthology of his and Ed's writings together. And in the beginning of it, David, he actually talked on the phone with Ed the day before he died, and they were talking. And Ed was talking about the future projects together. So it was going to the end. And Chris Black. In fact, I'll get to this later, but Ed introduced me to Chris Black, and Chris told me that wrote to me that he's the one who got Ed and David Peterson interested in the Rwanda situation. Yeah, so Ed and Chris actually, Chris and Ed had co-authored an article on Yugoslavia, and they were colleagues and buddies. And Ed's takes on Yugoslavia and Rwanda were typical of his efforts, as he basically exposed Western propaganda of those events, which turned reality upside down at times. And so, yeah, and Ed, though, even among leftists, Ed's perspective on Rwanda and Yugoslavia is still kind of a minority stance with a lot of the so-called left in this country or in the West. And so, yeah, Ed was radical take, but in my opinion, the accurate one. Yeah, I don't know if perspective is more accurate than Ed's on these issues, and Chris too. And so these guys, they knew their stuff. Brian, Brian came in and out of my life for about 20 years. In fact, literally, he died the same 20 years, almost exactly 20 years after I met him. Brian died, and when he had his second heart attack, about a year before he died, I knew the end was near. And so, and Brian, he was the most controversial astronaut. And in fact, he didn't have a biography in NASA. He was the only astronaut that didn't have a biography there. And his Wikipedia biography was like at this tabloid level. So it was terrible. And so anyway, this is now about 2010, 2009 and 10. And ran into 11 a little bit. But when Brian had a second heart attack. In fact, the first one was probably induced by spooks. He had a second one, and then he had a bout with cancer. In fact, the guy who treated and cured him was kidnapped by the FDA, taken back to prison in the United States. Those are all the world we live in. But Brian didn't have an NASA biography, and his Wikipedia biography was terrible. And so I offered to work on those biographies for Brian. I said, Brian, we need to get and it wasn't stated that the end was near, but I just that was my motivation to get this stuff on the record while Brian was still around, and I think he got it also. So he was like right with me there and getting this stuff done. Yeah, he was I think he was pleased I did that. Um, but I had to do in fact in 2008, literally about the year before, Brian had a second heart attack. I actually wrote an article because I had a friend and I were trying to Wikipedia had a massacre article which was wildly unbalanced. And so it was a thing where, the slaughter of 40,000 Indians doesn't get mentioned, but the killing of three settlers, so-called settlers, would get mentioned. And this is the wildly unbalanced Wikipedia kind of stuff. And so I tried to fix that. And I added got 20 massacres of Native Americans that Wikipedia failed to report on. And in a few days, they had erased all of our changes. And they were the only documented ones also. And it's like, yeah, so it was, in fact, and the admins were like the worst offenders too. This was anyway. So the idea, there's serious imperial ideology behind and racism, et cetera, behind Wikipedia. This is something that we discovered. And so anyway, so I knew that Wikipedia was definitely not a reliable source, let's say. And I knew that I was going to have a battle there. So I had a strategy, which was do Brian's NASA bio first. And then it'd be harder for them to wreck the Wikipedia bio. And that was my strategy. So anyway, I had an adventure publishing his NASA bio. That was a several month process. And it was eventually, though, I got in touch with the astronauts, and actually the astronaut corps treated me fairly and better than I expected. And Brian's bio, as it stands, is almost like Neil Armstrong's as far as his length, etc. So I was happy with the outcome of that. And again, Brian, his unique distinction was he was ordered to go to Mars because he was a Mars guy. This is when NASA had still had big plans of going to Mars. So yeah, they're expecting that Brian was going to end up in Mars, an orbital, so go to Mars and orbit it. By the 80s, that was the plan back in '67. Yeah. Anyway, then I got it published, his bio published by NASA, which again, Brian's first autobiography. Actually, there's a transcript of the interview he had there, and when they asked him to go to Mars, which blew Brian away. And but soon after the NASA published Brian's bio, this leading space skeptic started attacking Brian's Martian credentials with me, and totally incompetently. So it's like idiotically. And but this is yeah. When I came to understand how the skeptics operate, I'd already seen this. I've dealt with skeptics for a long, been attacked by skeptics for years, et cetera. So yeah, skeptics are attack dogs of the establishment. They're not truly skeptical. They're like these. In fact, a lot of them work for the CIA and this kind of thing. In fact, this space skeptic I think did work for the CIA. And so anyway, so then when I got Brian's NASA bio published finally, then I went after Wikipedia bio, and I was locked in edit battles with some of the other editors, et cetera, and I finally found it. Anyway, it turned out that eventually his bio got to be pretty good. And I was like, okay, I'm good with that. And it stayed the same way pretty much until when I try to get the libel out of Ed's bio at Wikipedia, an admin, and I leave this soon. He not only erased all my changes, etc. We helped over to Brian's bio and started hacking it up also. So this was, yeah, they were fervent. In fact, he got one way overboard. In fact, Wikipedia had to try to rein him in eventually. This admin was so out of control. In fact, today, Brian's free energy work is totally removed from his Wikipedia bio. But there's a thing called wiki quotes. So I was able to partially rectify that by putting in wiki quotes wiki quotes page for Brian. Like I'm about the only contributor to it. And that I was able to get enough in the wiki universe, I think, that Brian is, kind of fair. It's relatively fair presentation of Brian today. But that was a long journey. That was a lot of work to get there. Yeah, but yeah, so I succeeded with Brian. And actually, Grokpedia, so Elon Musk's new thing, actually, Brian's Grokpedia bio is worse than that Wikipedia, actually, which is that's too bad. Um, and really, Brian, I was the only biographer. I became Brian's only biographer. Again, which to me is a scandal. Yeah, Brian, he wrote his own. He wrote a bunch of books himself, some autobiographical. But Brian deserves. And then I mean, there's some bio work done on him. NASA did it on astronauts, etc. So there's some biographical stuff on Brian out there. But I'm really his only biographer. And as I am with Ed today. Really is the only biographer, which is too bad. Which again, both those guys should have professional biography, in my opinion. But my work will have to do until then. Um, and it's last year's. He only heard from me once a year or so, a couple times a year maybe. In fact, on his 90th birthday in 2015, I congratulated him on making it to 90. And he replied, he goes, all the parts of my body, they still work well enough. And he hoped that his writing into his 90s would help inspire people like me, young guys like me, that you can keep going, all the way to the end, into your 90s. And so, yeah, that was it, so that was cool. And then, in his last years, Ed was actually interviewed fairly frequently. Yeah, I've seen several interviews of Ed, read interviews of Ed in his last years, and he was once asked what he thought his contribution to scholarship was, and Ed replied that the pairing analysis that he said he didn't invent it, but he made it more popular in scholarship, is to take two similar situations and compare them, but one is by us and one's by an enemy, and how does the media differently treat them? And so this is his pairing analysis of similar situations, but who was involved dictated how the treatment would be. And then his other thing that he thought was his contribution was his portrayal of the media as just an elite, serving tool. Really. In fact, he said the idea of a party line. It's not just totalitarian nations have a party line. It says the so-called capitalist media does too. And so so now I'm going to discuss how I became Ed's first and so far only biographer. So on Ed's 92nd birthday, which turned out it was his last birthday. This is in 2017 in April. I again I sent him a happy birthday announcement, and Ed was really happy to hear from me. I mean, he wrote stuff like this. I'm really happy to hear from you, kind of thing. Yeah, that was how gracious Ed was. And so anyway, and when I wished him a happy birthday when he turned 92, I noted how terrible his Wikipedia biography was. I mean, it's libelous. To this day, it's still libelous. And anyway, but I sent him a link to Brian's bio at Wikipedia. I said, I'm offering, I can try to help improve your Wikipedia biography. And I made an offer. Anyway, a day or two later, I heard from Ed, and he actually replied that he wished I would. He goes, I wish you would do that. But he admitted how disgusting his Wikipedia bio was. But he said it'd be self-serving if I did it. He goes, yeah, I can't do it. And he also said he didn't think he had the stomach for it, and then he wrote to me. He said, Wade, you have no obligation to do this. And in fact, I have not suffered any repercussions from that biography of Wikipedia, but I wish you would take that on. And that's all the encouragement I needed. And so, and as with Brian, so in order to become a biographer of Brian, I can put this on pause for just a second. So in order to be Brian O'Leary's biographer, I had to do a lot of homework. I was digging it. I had to go to libraries and digging stacks. I was digging up Brian would write op-eds in the New York Times as he was a NASA gadfly, which is why he didn't have a NASA biography for so long. And anyway, I would just and scientific papers, his books and stuff. So I did a lot of homework In fact, I did a lot of that homework before I became his biographer. Yeah, when I think in our New Energy Movement days, I said I was doing a lot of that kind of work. And and so I felt like in order to do a creditable job with Ed, I had my homework to do when I started. And so, in fact, I found his two earliest political books. One was published in '66, the other one published in 1970, long out of print. I was able to obtain those, study those. In fact, again, the post accompanying this, you can see links to those chapters that reflect those my studies of those works. And I studied those, and then he actually had something called the Great Society Dictionary, which was again back to Head's humor. And so, and that one, in fact, I never, he said it was long out of print. I know I was never able to get a hold of his Great Society Dictionary, but there were later versions of that. So that was like an early version of his doublespeak dictionary. So in fact, in his book Demonstration Elections, he had at the end of it, he had kind of some of these ironic definitions, again, propaganda definitions kind of thing. And again, he wrote the book called Beyond Hypocrisy, and in that he had his doublespeak dictionary. And I reproduced it at Wiki. I reproduced a bunch of them on Wiki quotes, and to give a flavor of Ed's humor. Yeah, it was really funny, and in a really charming way. Yeah, it was really charming. Um, and in fact, in the wiki quotes, I actually quoted one of his entries was "Magic Bullet." And again, Ed was one of the few leftists, one of the few on the left who actually gave credence to the idea that Jack Kennedy was killed, in a conspiracy. And the Magic Bullet was part of that. And in fact, Lives of Our Times, one of its early issues, in fact, the first year I subscribed to it, one of its issues, the cover was actually one of the backyard photographs of Oswald, and the story inside was how Oliver Stone's JFK movie, they were still shooting it, and the mainstream media was attacking Stone's movie before it even got made. And so yeah, so this was, so Ed was on board. In fact, my reporting of the Gary Ween conversation with John Tower, I one day I sent that to Ed, and he was very interested. He was like, he thought it was really intriguing, that conversation with John Tower. In fact, Michael Prenny is the only other prominent lefty that I ever saw who argued for a conspiracy behind Jack Kennedy's murder. And that was one of several areas where Ed had a difference of opinion with Noam, which I will get to in the next post. Yeah, I've been asked to do this, and I'm going to. So I'm going to have a post on Ed and Noam and their work together and where they disagree and what Ed might think of today's events. And then again, I was hitting the books, and so I actually reread Noam and Ed's The Political Economy of Human Rights, which is the 2-volume effort that they published in '79 after their first book was subjected to an outrageous incident of censorship where the parent company put a subsidiary out of business to prevent the publication of Ed and Noam's first book together. And so anyway, so I remember rereading those, studying those deeply, so I could write about those in Fred's bio. And then if I remember the chapter on Rwanda in Ed's bio, that took weeks. And again, I had the book that he wrote with David Peterson on Rwanda back in 2014 or something. And anyway, but it was weeks. It took me a few weeks, as I recall, to write the chapter on Rwanda. I really had to go deep on it. To do it justice, I really had to go deep on that. And so that was one. So there's a lot of areas I really had to do a lot of homework on. Again, I've been reading Ed's work, for almost 30 years by that time. And so it's something that I was very familiar with. But in order to do a creditable job on a biography of Ed, I really had to go deep. In fact, I had to dig through my stacks in the library and find all my Z magazine issues. And in fact, I missed there were several I missed. I don't know what happened to them, but couldn't find them. But I had I have over 20 years of Z magazines that Ed wrote. In virtually every issue, Ed wrote an article. In fact, one of my chapters is summarizing those. So anyway, this is the part. This is how you do it. This is how I did that, And so Rwanda, I had to go deep on that to really understand it well. Yeah, you have to. There's no substitute for doing that work. And so I did. I did the work on Rwanda. I've been writing about Yugoslavia actually for many years. My American Empire essay has a few chapters on Yugoslavia, how we tore it apart. And I had used Ed's work in my Yugoslavia writings before. And again, I had long written about Ed Noma's work on the media, beginning with Lies of Our Times, manufactured consent, all that stuff. And so for a lot of the areas, it was stuff I was very familiar with. So it made me, qualified to attempt to write Ed's biography. But that email that Ed gave to me back in April, that was the last email Ed ever sent me personally. That was the last exchange Ed and I ever had. And in fact, by his 92nd birthday, his output at Z Magazine was sporadic. It wasn't every month anymore. In the last year, I don't know, maybe, in the previous year, he maybe published 4 articles or something. Wasn't it 4 or 5, some number like that? And so this was a thing where I could see Ed's output declining. And so kind of with Brian, I realized the end was probably near. And so that's why I did that. Why I made the offer to Ed is to do that while Ed was still alive, try to get that done. And I was right, unfortunately, that the end was near with it. Yeah, it's a lot. Again, I didn't hear from him again. And in fact, after he told me to go for it on his bio, he only published 2 articles after that. One was in Z. It was a media hysteria over Russia. No, I think it was MR Online, actually. He published a Z article, I believe, that month. That was his last Z article, was the month of his 92nd birthday. And then MR Online, he published an article on the media hysteria over Russia. Yeah, a century of fake news about Russia. And then the last article published in his lifetime was on propaganda while at 30 years old in Project Uncensored's annual book, which was published in October. This was, again, just before he died. In fact, he did an interview also with some of his fanboy activists, literally like the month before he died. So a few weeks before he died, he did one final interview. And that was it. In fact, and then in this last article, so the last words published in his lifetime, that's the article, in that article, Ed concluded that the propaganda model was as strong as applicable as it was 30 years ago. And in fact, the last words published in Ed's lifetime was, the propaganda model lives on. And yes, it does. And as long as there's a capitalist media, the propaganda model will be relevant. Yeah, it's the granddaddy of this stuff. And so it'll be relevant as long as we have a capitalist media, which means until the fifth epoch arrives, it's only the fifth epoch was going to kill capitalism. Until the fifth epoch arrives, the capitalist press is going to be a propaganda tool of the elite. That's how it works. That's what Ed's work was about. However, I did receive one last email from Ed a couple months before his death. And actually, I remember sending an email to Ed that late summer, that autumn, just like, Ed, what's up? Because he hadn't published anything. I was like, I knew something was up with Ed. And so I didn't hear back. But around that same time, maybe a few weeks later after I did that, I got an email from Ed. But it wasn't to me so much, but I was copied in. So I was copied in with about a dozen people, maybe 15 people or something. And it was an announcement related to his work to some other guys. It was Ed writing to somebody else, but he copied in like 15 of us. And I felt that was intentional by Ed, because I think probably he knew the end was near, and this is his way of sort of connecting the people in one of his circles. And so we see each other's email addresses, and none of us did anything about that. None of us responded. But literally a couple months later, when I was really concerned about Ed, and I actually emailed the recipient of that email. I said, what's up with Ed? Have you heard about what's up with Ed? And this guy, he said that he hadn't heard anything. And then that same guy, just a couple days later, he sent me an email, which was the announcement of Ed's death. And so, and so that was the end for Ed. Yeah, he died on November 11th, 2017. But that email that Ed wrote was introduced me to Christopher Black and Sam Husseini. Yeah, they were on that string. And in fact, I announced to that group that Ed had died because it was news. News wasn't really out there yet, and so I emailed that circle, and then we started interacting, and then and that's how I met Chris and Sam, and and in fact, exactly a week before Ed died, I wasn't hearing anything, so I decided, and I really wanted Ed to like take a look at it before I published it. But I just finally said I got to start doing this. So I published anyway. I published the first draft of my essay, my biography of Ed, a week before he died. And and in fact, then when I notified uh, that circle, didn't include Noam in it, but it was a bunch of his early colleagues. Um, Sam actually was instrumental in getting Ed's obituary published in Washington Post and the New York Times. And so, Sam had my eternal gratitude just for doing that. And in fact, in the New York Times, their obituary was actually a confirmation of the propaganda model because they said that he and Noam were soft pedaling reports of atrocities in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. Well, the only problem was manufacturing consent was published before those incidents happened. This is anyway, and Ed and Noam didn't. I'll get to this in my next post. But it's like they weren't downplaying anything. Their whole thing was just comparing the facts on the ground to how the media reported. And again, to show the bias in the media. That was their trip. It wasn't to say who the good guys and bad guys were in Rwanda or whatever, or try to come up with an accurate count. That wasn't their intention, which has been misrepresented ever since, which I'll get to. Um, and one or two of his Ed's buddies who I heard from is like, again, we interacted a bit out, and once Ed died, there was a flood of emails going between us, and when that New York Times bio came out, one of his buddies he goes, Ed would have been pleased to see that. Yeah, he'd ever been amused and pleased to see that the New York Times couldn't get around lying about Ed's work. Yeah, this is what they do. So anyway, it was a confirmation of his work. So the New York Times inadvertently, in their efforts to try to keep throwing mud at him, dismissing him, they were proving his point. And in fact, and from that, when notification, Chris read my chapter. He went right straight to my chapter on Rwanda and read that. And I didn't know of a greater authority on earth on that chapter than Chris. And Chris raved about it. Yeah, Chris loved it. And in fact, that began our friendship. And so that was also my first indication that I was doing justice to his life and work. And Chris and I were friends the rest of his life, and he died here last year. But like with Ed, it didn't go beyond emails, which I wish it had, but it didn't. Chris died. In fact, Chris, I wanted to do his bio work for Chris too. I told him that. I've posted some about Chris at Substack on my site about Chris, and so Chris was a great one. He was one of the greatest human rights attorney on earth, man. He led Milosevic's defense, and he actually got an acquittal in the Kangaroo Court Tribunal in Rwanda, amazingly, over one of the generals there in Rwanda. And and then Sam. So I have a friendship with Sam, and still emails. Maybe it'll be more than that one day. But anyway, those guys are my heroes. You guys are my pantheon, beacons in the darkness. Yes, these are truly great human beings. That has been a great honor for me to have known in any way, interacted with. And so, carrying Ed Spears is definitely one of my life's greatest honors, is doing that. And with Brian, so I did his NASA bio first before I published I'll just say before I went after Wikipedia. Kind of did the same thing with Ed. So I published that draft of my bio of Ed again a week before he died. And again, I'd already seen how Wikipedia played ball with, again, that Mastergler article when they when they wiped out all my editions, which were the only credible ones in the article. And again, and Ed's Wikipedia bio is truly disgusting and really libelous, and led by actually Wikipedia's most infamous editor, who was eventually banned from Wikipedia because this guy just couldn't stop lying about people and stuff. So it was Oh my. And so and Chris again, Chris Black, he was enraged by Ed's Wikipedia bio. He thought he was really angry about that. And in fact, Chris a year before Ed died, Chris's Wikipedia biography got erased, got deleted on the so-called notability issue. Yeah, you can be the most important human rights attorney on earth, but if you don't, the New York Times isn't quoting you, then you're not notable enough for Wikipedia. And they admit it. This is how Wikipedia operates. Um, and Ed though, so Chris, his love for Ed, his respect for Ed was very, very clear. Ed did not have a stauncher friend than Chris, and Chris. Again, Chris is the one who actually interested Ed and David Peterson in the Rwanda situation. So again, Ed and Chris had actually co-authored an article back in 2000 on what was happening in Yugoslavia. And I said again, Chris led the defense for Milosevic. In fact, Ed thought that Milosevic died in custody at that tribunal, and Ed thought it was criminal negligence because they literally refused Milosevic's request to get treatment for his heart condition, and he soon died. But also, Milosevic thought he was being poisoned, and Chris actually got the autopsy results. He said there was evidence that he was poisoned. There's a little difference of opinion with it. Ed didn't think they needed to poison him; they already had him locked up and muzzled, so they didn't need to go that far. Chris thought though there was evidence that they did, because actually he thought that Milosevic was engaged, had a spirited defense. It was a successful defense, kind of like how he got the acquittal there in Rwanda. And so Chris thought that they decided one way they're going to win is just kill him. That's what Chris thought. And you know what? Might be right. I wouldn't put it past him, that's for sure. Um, but when Chris, anyway, so Chris actually informed Ed and David one day. So they met, and I was telling Ed and David about Rwanda, what was going on there, and how the media's portrayal was actually upside down from reality. Anyway, and that was he got Ed hot on the trail of that. And that was the last big writing a project of Ed's life was Rwanda, and that was it was his last big one. And Ed's stance was in my opinion, it's the most accurate one you're going to see in the West, which was Paul Kagame was an American tool, just like Suharto of Indonesia, et cetera. This is normal, right? So he's this mass murderer that we supported. It wasn't like Suharto came with a coup, but Kagame was a conquest, actually a military invasion and conquest of Rwanda. And subsequently, they invaded the Congo and killed several million people. Yeah, Ed wrote that Kagame is probably the greatest living mass murderer. Yeah, he's responsible for millions of deaths. And somehow the West portrays him as this hero, Abe Lincoln figure who rescued Rwanda. And in fact, he just had, I think last year, he just had another so-called election where the guy gets 99% of the vote, which is a scandal. Which you won't see anything on the West on this, and how it's totally just this. It's like Suharto's Indonesia, what's going on there in Rwanda. And but so Chris informed me. He wrote that when he introduced Ed and David to what was happening in Rwanda and they took it on, Chris was like very impressed with their courage. Because it was going to be a thankless task taking on the propaganda barrage in the West, the United States in particular, English-speaking West in particular. And again, the whole thing, Rwanda thing, it turns out that probably what was going on was the Canadian, British, and the United States was displacing French interests in the area. That was really, in the big picture, that's probably what was going on, to get a hold of the mining and this kind of stuff, which is about the invasion of Congo, all this kind of stuff. And you're not going to see a credible coverage in the media on that. Yeah. So anyway, so it took me a while to get it right, to study what Ed and David had written on Rwanda and publish that. And so I think it's the accurate view still. The second. Yeah, so I put Ed's take on Rwanda up against anybody's, Ed and David. I put it up to anybody. Chris, yeah. So Chris, David, Ed, yeah. Yeah, it's just another this the standard imperial story, and this is kind of the point of Ed's work is that again back to bloodbath framework, etc. And so as I'll get to later is yeah, it's comparing this to Yugoslavia to Rwanda, etc., and the incredible disparity in media coverage. And this is what, and again, I'll get into this later on that, where in fact, yeah, I'm going to do this. I'll do this later. How Ed's scientific approach to it is so unassailable. So it's not. Yeah, Ed's critics never take on his actual work itself. They just have to lie about it, misrepresent it, which is how propagandists operate. Um, so I didn't really try to improve Ed's Wikipedia biography until the summer of 2018. This is now, yes, 8 months after Ed died, I think, 7, 8 months. And I spent about 100 hours actually mastering the changes. It was comprehensive. And again, it was to try to get it out of the propaganda mode into something that was credible. Because it wasn't. Ed's bio today is not credible at all. And so it's a thing of I was trying to move it into the realm of credibility. And anyway, so I spent 100 hours mastering my changes and I put them out there. And within a few hours, they were all wiped out, reversed. And in fact, again, as what I noticed with the wiki when we were did the massacre article, a friend of mine was trying to improve the massacre article. The worst offenders actually weren't the editors; it was the admins. So the people who worked for Wikipedia were the worst offenders in this propaganda version of events. And yeah, and so there was this admin who jumped right in and he wiped out all of my not only wiped all of my changes, but and in fact in Wikipedia jargon this thing called reverting. And you can see the history of an article. So you can actually so my changes I made, he reverted them all, but in the history you should be able to see that. You see what I did and what he did. Well, he actually went further and actually erased all that even so the public couldn't even see what I'd done, which is a nuclear option and Wikipedia, which is almost never done. Yeah, so he went way over the line. In fact, so far over the line, Wikipedia eventually overrode him. And so they at least restored the history that I actually tried to make these changes. And this guy went so far over the line that Wikipedia had to kind of rein him in. And one of my pupils actually was so outraged by what they had done, he jumped into the fray and Wikipedia banned him. And he had edited Wikipedia for years and they banned him, etc. So this was, again, the totalitarian nature of Wikipedia. Yeah. So they can make it up as they go. They were judge, juror, and executioner on issues. And again, an imperial mouthpiece. And this goes back to Jimmy, what's his name? The founder, etc. Now he married Tony Blair's secretary. So he's just, total imperial tool. So Wikipedia is this big imperial tool. In fact, 2 years later, I actually wrote an essay on the propaganda model in Wikipedia and applying the propaganda model to Wikipedia. And again, as it stands today, Ed's Wikipedia bio is another confirmation of the propaganda model. Yeah, so this is again, so they prove Ed's point. So they lie about him and smear him, and they're actually proving Ed's point. And so and great irony. And in fact, last year, Grokpedia launched, and there's an article on Ed, and it's the first credible mainstream biography of Ed that I've seen. I'm aware of. I don't think this is the first one. And Grokpedia has limitations. Like I tried to add something to the George Washington biography where he swindled the Indians out of the continent. He was the guy who architected that. And that was too far for Wikipedia to father our country stuff. But and Ed's bio though is good. It's a really credible bio of Ed's, and so Elon Musk gets some credit for that. That one biography of Ed rises above the propaganda, and again, just compare that to the Wikipedia bio, and you'll see how propaganda operates. it's so blatant what Wikipedia has done, and defeated all attempts to improve the article. Yeah, this is really something. Um, Chris, they mentioned Chris was, yeah, he raved about the Wikipedia, my article on Wikipedia. Chris raved about that too, and again was doubly angry about what they had done to Ed at Wikipedia. Um, yeah, it was. Yeah, I'll do a video on Chris one of these days soon. And then my next post is going to be about Ed and his relationship with Noam and the Epstein issue, which I've already weighed in on this once, but with all the sturm and drang happening, I think I am obligated to write about this a little bit more. In the end, it took about 18 months of my spare time to complete my biography project on Ed. I know it's a labor of love. It's like, I love that guy. I miss Ed. Yeah, Ed was definitely one of my heroes, and he told me he worked in the ivory tower. He wasn't out there getting shot at or anything, but he had a role to play and he played it brilliantly, wonderfully. Yeah, definitely he'll go down in history as one of its greatest dissident intellectuals. And I'm so honored to have known him in any way, and to be his first and so far only biography so far is definitely um how to say it. I wish a professional would do it, but working on his bio, it was labor, love, and an honor. So I missed it. So that's all for now.